first scream didn't rise from the cockpit. It ripped out of the aisle instead. Heavy boots pounded through the narrow walkway as three-armed men pushed forward, shouting words no one fully understood.
All of you.
Rifles swung loosely, their dark muzzles sweeping across faces like silent accusations. A drink cart tipped and slammed against the seats. Glass shattered. A woman screamed. Somewhere, a man began praying out loud. Only moments earlier, the aircraft had felt calm and ordinary. Now it felt too tight, too small to hold breath or thought. Victor? Kovac stopped at the center of the cabin and seized the closest flight attendant by the arm. Mara Ellison didn't fight him. He shoved her down between the rows, pressing on her shoulder until her knees struck the carpet. His voice stayed even, almost bored, as he explained that this was what happened to people who forgot their place. Passengers watched, frozen in their seats. Some looked away, guilt and relief tangled together. They were grateful it wasn't them. Mara kept her gaze lowered. Her hands rested calmly on her thighs. She appeared small, plain, already broken. But one man noticed what didn't fit. Cole Barrett watched how she settled her weight, how her breathing slowed instead of racing, how she stayed perfectly balanced on her knees, even as light turbulence rattled the plane. Fear flooded the cabin. Judgment pressed heavy in the air. Mara Ellison was in her early 40s. The kind of woman most people looked past rather than at. Her hair was tightly pinned, her navy uniform crisp, her face set in that practiced airline calm that made strangers feel safe without demanding attention. She'd flown this route so many times, she could picture the cabin with her eyes closed. The loose seatbelt on the toddler in row 10, the man who always asked for 2 sugars, the anxious first-time flyer gripping the armrest like a lifeline. Her world ran on routine. Comfort came from repetition, and repetition came from doing small things exactly right. To the passengers, she wasn't a person so much as a service, a moving uniform, a polite voice that meant coffee, blankets, and rules about tray tables. Even now, as fear crept through the cabin like smoke, most of them still saw her as harmless, safely powerless. That was why Victor Kovac chose her. He didn't just want control of the aircraft. He wanted control of the story unfolding inside it. And humiliating a flight attendant was the easiest way to teach. 200 people how to obey without resistance. Mara stayed on her knees until he released her. When he finally moved away, she stood slowly, as if all strength had drained from her body. She walked down the aisle with her head bowed, gathering spilled cups, straightening what she could. It gave her hands a task. It gave her permission to move. It gave her angles, distances, faces, and... Time Senator Paul Whitmore sat near the front in a wide seat, his shoulders rigid with anger he couldn't act on. He looked at Mara the way powerful men sometimes looked at staff when things went wrong, as if she were part of the problem. As if she should fix it simply because she wore a uniform. When she stopped beside his row to check on a trembling woman, Whitmore leaned close and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. He told her she needed to do something useful, that the crew had responsibilities, that someone should speak to the men and resolve this. The words sounded brave. They were really contempt disguised as authority. He spoke like she was customer service, paid to absorb frustration. Mara didn't argue. She didn't react. She gave him a small nod, the same one she'd used 1,000 times on angry passengers and exhausted parents, and moved on. Behind her, Linda Moore watched everything. Linda was the senior attendant on the flight. Mid-50s, sharp-eyed, the type who could read a cabin like a weather chart. She'd trained crews for years and knew panic left traces even when people tried to hide it. Mara was leaving none. The hijackers patrolled the aisle, taking phones, checking bins, barking orders that made grown men shrink. The cabin lights felt too bright, reflecting off sweat-slicked faces and glassy eyes. The steady hum of the engine sounded louder now, as if the plane itself were listening. Mara moved through it with controlled steps. Her shoulders never slumped. Her breathing stayed measured. Her hands remained visible and empty. But her eyes didn't wander like frightened eyes usually did. They tracked. Cole Barrett hadn't wanted an aisle seat, but it was the last one available. Now it gave him a clear view of everything that mattered. His body slipped into an old mode of awareness. 18 years in the Air Force didn't fade politely. It lingered in habits, watching hands, measuring spacing, listening for changes in tone, assessing threats without drawing attention. He noticed how Mara watched Victor without staring, how she counted the men without moving her lips, how her gaze flicked to the cockpit door, then to the emergency phone, then to the nearest bulkhead, like she was assembling a mental map. Others fixated on the guns. Mara focused on timing. When the plane hit rough air, the cabin jolted. Passengers gasped. A woman clutched her husband's wrist. A child whimpered. Mara adjusted her stance before the bump fully landed, a subtle shift that kept her balanced without grabbing a seat. It was a reflex Cole recognized from flight crews and pilots used to unstable ground. Linda saw it too. Their eyes met briefly. What Linda saw wasn't fear. It was calculation. Mara knelt beside an older man struggling to breathe, her voice soft as she guided him through slow breaths. Her fingers found his wrist with practiced accuracy. She checked his pulse like she was reading an instrument, and scanned the cabin again, already moving before thanks could be spoken. It wasn't coldness. It was discipline. Cole felt something tighten in his gut, a sense of recognition he couldn't yet name. Around them, people cried quietly, whispered prayers, clung to one another. Mara moved like someone who had accepted fear as a condition, not a catastrophe. She didn't look heroic. That was what unsettled him most. She looked deliberately forgettable. As she reached the galley curtain, Victor's eyes lingered on her a second too long. No smile, none was needed. She returned with water bottles, distributing them calmly. Each stop added another detail. Victor favored his right side. One man gripped his weapon too tightly. Another scanned exits like he was counting options. Then came a moment so quick, it almost vanished, her eyes lifted toward the overhead speaker. Not with concern for announcements, but the way someone listened for radio traffic. Her jaw tightened slightly, as if recognizing a familiar voice in memory. Cole swallowed hard. He'd spent years around pilots. He knew the look of someone hearing an invisible channel. Mara wore that same quiet readiness, like a checklist completing inside her mind. In the galley, Linda leaned in and asked softly if she was okay. Mara nodded. Her voice stayed steady as she told Linda to keep people calm and the aisle clear, as if issuing routine safety guidance instead of managing a hostage cabin. Linda almost asked why she sounded so certain. Then Victor shifted, listening. Mara lowered her gaze again, shrinking back into the role everyone expected. She became the tired attendant with the gentle voice, the background woman. But Cole knew better. She wasn't waiting for courage. She was waiting for timing. The takeover became complete when the cockpit stayed silent and the captain's voice never returned. The plane flew on, steady and indifferent, while the cabin transformed into a controlled cage. The hijackers no longer needed to shout constantly. Fear did that work for them. Victor Kovac paced the aisle like he owned the sky. Tomas Vargas followed, memorizing faces and movements like a technician studying a machine. Eli Novak moved like violence barely contained, snapping at anyone who cried too loudly, kicking bags loose just to remind people of their helplessness. A rhythm settled in. Silence, then a sharp command. Stillness, then a calm threat that promised follow-through. People stopped asking questions. Questions required hope, and hope was the first thing taken. Phones were collected next. Vargas walked the aisle with a plastic bag, voice clipped and final. When someone hesitated, Novak leaned in, weapon angled just enough to make its meaning clear. Screens vanished one by one, and with them went the last illusion that anyone outside the cabin could see what was happening. A teenage boy tried to keep his phone hidden beneath his thigh. Novak caught the movement instantly, ripped the device free, smashed it into the armrest until the screen webbed and went dark. The crack of breaking glass echoed through the cabin like a gunshot without the recoil. Everyone understood the message. Mara Ellison continued moving through the aisle with water bottles, balanced in both hands. Her face composed, her voice low and steady. She spoke to shaking passengers the way a calm nurse spoke in an emergency room, reminding them to breathe slowly, to keep their hands where they could be seen, to lean back and stay still. She gave their fear instructions, and somehow that made it manageable. Even if they didn't know why, Linda Moore followed a few steps behind, using the service cart as a partial shield whenever she could. Her hands trembled at times, but her chin stayed lifted. She had handled turbulence, medical crises, panic attacks, even death at 30,000 feet. This was different. This was intentional. And Mara's calm, set against it, looked almost unnatural. That made it dangerous, Victor noticed. He made sure she understood that he noticed without ever saying her name. Every time Mara stopped to offer water, his eyes tracked her like a targeting reticle. Every time she crouched beside a passenger, he watched how her feet were placed. The cabin was quiet, but the scrutiny was deafening. Cole Barrett sat stiffly in his seat, shoulders locked, gaze snapping between the three hijackers in Mara's path. He despised being forced into the role of observer. He hated helplessness most of all, because he knew what helplessness became once panic crossed a certain line. Plans began to whisper themselves into existence. They always did. Someone with courage and no strategy started gathering resolve from strangers like it was ammunition. Mara sensed it before the murmurs reached her row. She didn't turn her head, but her eyes shifted, tracking the subtle surge of movement. She could feel a storm building inside the cabin. Storms in tight spaces killed more people than they saved. Victor announced a destination no one believed. He demanded negotiations, demanded a broadcast, demanded to be taken seriously. It sounded political, but everyone heard the truth beneath it. He was claiming ownership of time itself. Minutes stretched. The engines hummed steadily. The air felt stale and thin, saturated with sweat and fear. People tried to remain silent, but the silence pressed down on them like weight. Then Victor rewrote the rules. He walked to the center of the cabin and pointed toward a woman seated with her hands folded over her rounded stomach. Emily Carter, pregnant, her eyes red from crying without sound. A small boy sat beside her, face buried in her sleeve, trying to disappear. Owen Carter didn't understand hijackers. He understood only that his mother was afraid, and the only way he knew to help was by being small. Victor told Novak to bring her. Emily shook her head immediately, pleading without words. Her husband wasn't on this flight. She had no shield but strangers who could barely protect themselves. Novak seized her arm and yanked her up so hard she stumbled. Owen cried out, clinging to her hand. Novak shoved the boy back into the seat with careless force, his head striking the headrest. The cabin reacted as one body, one sharp inhale of collective pain. Mara moved before anyone else could. She stepped into the aisle. Palms open, voice gentle, almost apologetic. She told Novak he could take her instead. She said Emily was pregnant. She said the child was frightened. She promised cooperation if they were allowed to stay seated. Novak laughed. He called her brave like it was an insult. He tightened his grip on Emily's arm just to prove a point. Mara didn't change expression. She stayed close. Close enough that Novak had to look at her. Close enough that his weapon couldn't swing freely without risk. She shifted slightly, as if nervous, as if clumsy. As if she were about to trip on the seat frame. Her elbow brushed Novak's wrist at the exact moment the aircraft hit a small, natural pocket of turbulence. To anyone watching, it looked accidental. A frightened attendant stumbling under pressure. But Novak's grip loosened for half a second. That was all she needed. Mara guided Emily back into her seat with one steady hand. With the other, she redirected Novak's arm downward, using leverage so subtle it barely registered his movement. No struggle. No drama. Just a quiet correction of balance and force. Emily collapsed into the seat, gasping, pulling Owen tight against her chest. Mara stepped back immediately, hands raised, eyes lowered, dissolving into the background again. Novak's smile vanished. He didn't know how he'd lost control, but he felt it, and that made him furious. Victor knew. His gaze sharpened as he approached, slow and deliberate. He looked down at Mara the way a predator looked at prey that had done something unexpected. His voice stayed soft, but it carried. He told her that if she tried anything like that again, he would break the pregnant woman first. He stated it like policy, like a rule already written. Mara nodded once. submissive on the surface. Inside, something locked into place. Not fear, not anger. A cold understanding that the cabin was balanced on a blade's edge. Cole watched, his stomach turning. He had seen train movement before. He recognized it instantly. And he knew Victor had seen it too. Would you have stayed seated in that moment, watching a pregnant woman dragged into the aisle? Or would you have stood, knowing exactly what it might cost? The cabin tried to return to stillness, but it couldn't. Emily's shaking spread fear like a contagion. Owen's whimpers made it worse. No human heart could ignore a child. Whispers rose again, sharper now, urgent. A civilian in a gray hoodie near the back leaned toward the men around him, speaking fast and low. He gestured toward the nearest hijacker, toward the galley curtain, toward the way Novak wandered too far from Victor. It was planning born of courage alone, without training. Mara saw him immediately. One quick glance took in his hands, his posture, the way his eyes measured the aisle. She could see the story forming in his head. Rush them, grab the gun, be a hero. Her throat tightened. She knew how that story usually ended. A cabin wasn't a battlefield. The space was too confined, the angles too unforgiving, and the enemy had already decided how far they were willing to go. The man stood anyway. Two others rose with him. Sudden movement, a burst of hope that jolted the cabin. For one raw heartbeat, it looked like numbers might matter. People leaned forward. Breath was held. Someone whispered, "Do it," like a prayer. Victor turned his head. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush. He lifted his weapon and fired into the ceiling. The crack tore through the cabin, shattering the last illusion of safety. Screams erupted. People ducked. Owen sobbed, burying his face into Emily's chest. The would-be heroes froze mid-charge, suddenly remembering they were flesh, not legends. Novak slammed one man into an aisle seat and drove his forearm into the man's throat. Varga moved with chilling precision, twisting an arm, pinning another body down with practiced ease. Victor spoke over the chaos, his voice calm and absolute. He said this was the only warning. He said the next attempt would end with someone dying in front of their family. He didn't need to shout. Fear carried the message. Mara stood motionless in the aisle, hands visible, eyes lowered. She looked as helpless as everyone else, but inside her mind was racing. She measured Victor's response time. She noted how Varga positioned his body, which side he favored, how he protected his line of fire. She watched Novak's aggression, the sloppiness of it, the way ego made him dangerous. She was mapping a problem the way a pilot mapped weather in the sky. Would you have rushed forward, driven by fear and courage? Or would you have waited, knowing that patience might save more lives than bravery ever could? The cabin eventually went quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of hope. It was the quiet of learned helplessness, heavy and suffocating. A man in the back sobbed openly. A woman whispered prayers until her lips numbed. Senator Whitmore sat rigid. His earlier arrogance drained into something fragile and human. Mara moved toward the rear of the cabin, collecting fallen bottles, calming whoever she could without drawing attention. She crouched beside the man Novak had slammed, offering a tissue, offering soft words, offering dignity in a moment where dignity was almost gone. Mara leaned closer to Linda Moore for a brief moment, her voice barely rising above the steady hum of the engines. She told Linda to keep everyone seated, to keep them breathing, to shut down any more attempts at heroics. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. There was something in the firmness of her voice that made Linda obey without question, as Mara straightened and turned back toward the aisle. Victor's gaze locked onto hers again. This time, there was something new in his eyes. Not "who are you?" Not yet. It was "what are you hiding?" Mara dropped her eyes and disappeared back into the background because she understood the truth better than anyone else on board. There was no clean exit at this altitude. No rescue storming through the clouds in time. There was only the cabin, the rhythm of terror, and the tightening pressure of a moment that would break one way or another. And Victor was watching her now. The way a man watched something disciplined beneath a uniform, never meant to conceal it. The aircraft dipped slightly. Not enough to alarm seasoned travelers, but enough to slosh drinks in clenched stomachs. Several passengers gasped anyway, hands snapping to armrests. Eyes darting upward as if the ceiling might offer answers. Ellison adjusted her stance before the motion finished. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't grab a seat or brace against the bulkhead. Her feet widened, just a fraction, knees softening. Weight centered like someone who had learned long ago how machines moved through air. The recognition hit Cole Barrett slow and deep. He had seen that adjustment 1,000 times on flight lines and in briefing rooms. Pilots did it without thinking, bodies tuned to pitch and yaw the way sailors read waves. Civilians reacted after motion. Pilots moved with it. Mara moved with it. She kept walking, water bottles steady, her head never snapping toward the windows. Instead, her eyes lifted briefly to the overhead panel, not for reassurance, but as if she were listening. As if the aircraft itself were speaking. Another shift followed, sharper this time. Overhead bins rattled. Someone cursed quietly. Mara's hand rose instinctively, palm open, signaling calm to the row she was passing. Her voice stayed even as she told them it was only light turbulence and to keep their seatbelts fastened. The words were routine. The timing was not. Cole watched her mouth the count silently. 1, 2, 3. The same cadence pilots used while riding instability. Waiting for the aircraft to settle back into its envelope, Dr. Nathan Brooks noticed it too, though he couldn't have explained it right away. He was trained to recognize decisiveness under stress, to know when calm was competence instead of denial. As a trauma surgeon, he lived in moments where hesitation killed faster than blood loss. When the man Novak had slammed earlier began to wheeze, Brooks dropped to assess him. Mara was already there. She didn't hover. She didn't ask permission. She checked airway, posture, responsiveness, with quick, precise movements. Then told Brooks exactly what she needed without raising her voice. Seat back up. Chin lifted. Slow breaths. There was no uncertainty in her tone. Brooks followed her instructions automatically. Only afterward did he realize what had happened. She hadn't deferred. She had directed. The way someone did when they were used to being obeyed in emergencies. Linda Moore stood nearby, pretending to adjust the galley curtain. She watched Mara's hands, how they moved with purpose. Never wasted, never shaking. When Victor demanded a check-in with the cockpit, Mara was sent forward to relay the order. She stopped just outside the reinforced door and lifted the emergency handset. Her posture shifted subtly, shoulders squared, spine aligned. It was like she'd stepped into a different space altogether. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clipped. She didn't say please. She didn't soften her words with apologies or filler. She identified the situation, relayed the instruction, and requested confirmation using phrasing Linda had never heard from civilian crew. Say again? Stand by. A chill ran up Linda's arms. No civilian spoke like that under pressure. Flight attendants were trained to soothe, to de-escalate, to wrap authority in courtesy. Mara spoke for clarity, not comfort. When the reply crackled through the handset, Mara listened without interrupting. She nodded once, replaced the phone, and turned. Victor was watching from the aisle, his head tilted slightly. His eyes narrowed not with anger, but evaluation. He had been around disciplined people before. He recognized the sound of it, the way it stripped emotion down to essentials. He stepped closer. Invading her space, testing her reaction, Mara lowered her gaze again. Let her shoulders slope. Let the illusion of weakness settle back into place. Victor didn't step away. Cole felt the tension shift. The hijackers had expected fear, chaos, pleading. What they hadn't expected was quiet competence, moving inside their cage without permission. Another change in pitch rippled through the cabin, stronger now. People cried out. Someone shouted toward the front, demanding answers no one had. Mara's hand rose again, steady. Her eyes tracked the movement before it finished. She braced, adjusted, then relaxed like someone who trusted the aircraft to do what it was designed to do. Cole swallowed. He remembered briefing rooms where pilots talked about trusting the machine, knowing when to intervene and when to let physics work. Mara carried that trust in her bones. Dr. Brooks leaned toward Cole, barely moving his lips. He asked if Cole was seeing what he was seeing. Cole nodded once. As Mara passed the galley, Linda caught a fragment of a murmur. Something about timing, about altitude. Not meant for anyone else. It wasn't fear. It was analysis. Linda's pulse spiked. She had trained hundreds of attendants. She knew every form of nervousness, every coping behavior. This was none of them. Victor's certainty darkened. He watched Mara with predator patience, letting the cabin breathe just enough to see what else would surface. He tested her with proximity, sudden movements, sharp orders meant to provoke. Mara absorbed it all. She let herself look small, let herself look unimportant, but she never looked lost. By now, the audience, like the passengers, could feel it. The pieces were scattered but deliberate. The way she stood, the way she spoke, the way fear bent around her instead of through her. Who was she? A veteran? A pilot? Something else entirely. The mystery tightened with every passing minute. The cabin wasn't just afraid anymore. It was uneasy, sensing that the story unfolding in the air wasn't the one it had been promised. Victor. Kovac sensed it too. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her past. But he knew this much with cold. Clarity, the woman in the flight attendant's uniform, was trained, and training under pressure was far more dangerous than fear. The galley smelled of spilled coffee and recycled air. The kind of enclosed space where sound traveled farther than it should. The curtain swayed gently with the aircraft's movement. Hiding the narrow corridor from 200 frightened eyes, Novak grabbed Mara's arm without warning and yanked her back. She let herself stumble. Her shoulder clipped the cart. Her foot caught the floor track. She went with the motion, gasping softly like a woman, finally breaking. To anyone watching from the aisle, it looked exactly the way Novak wanted it to look. Weakness. He shoved her through the curtain and slammed her against the counter. His breath was hot with adrenaline and cruelty. He told her she was getting brave. He told her brave people were the first to get hurt. Mara kept her eyes down. Her hands rose slowly, palms open, compliant. Her breathing sped up just enough to look like fear without letting fear take control. She waited. The aircraft rolled slightly. Minor correction most passengers never noticed. The cartwheels rattled. Novak shifted his weight to stay balanced, leaning in closer, crowding her space. That was the opening. Mara moved in one clean. Silent sequence, her hands snapped up not to strike, but to redirect. She caught Novak's wrist and elbow. Together, folding Novak's wrist and elbow across his own centerline as she stepped through the space. He didn't realize he'd given up. His weapon hand slammed flat against the counter, shoulder locked, balance stripped away in an instant. She didn't slam him. She didn't throw him. She dismantled him. Novak made a sound that started as surprise and tried to turn into anger. But it never completed the thought. Mara drove her forearm into the nerve cluster beneath his jaw with controlled precision. Just enough pressure to shut him down without a sound. His body sagged. She guided him to the floor, easing his head so it wouldn't strike metal. His breathing stayed, shallow but steady. Mara didn't look at him again. She was already moving for the galley door when Tomas Varga pushed through the curtain. Weapon raised. He took in Novak on the floor and understood everything in a single heartbeat. Varga didn't shout. He didn't rush. He adapted. Mara saw the change immediately, the shift from intimidation to engagement. He was disciplined, cautious, dangerous in a quieter way. She raised her hands again, backing up, letting him believe he still owned the moment. Her eyes flicked once, mapping the narrow space, the angles. How the cart blocked one line, while the wall closed another. Varga advanced. Muzzle steady on center mass, finger light on the trigger. Mara waited until he stepped fully inside. The aircraft jolted again. She dropped low with the motion, letting the turbulence mask her movement. Varga fired. The round tore into the galley wall, where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The sound deafening in the confined space. Mara surged forward under the weapon. Driving her shoulder into his chest and slamming him back into the bulkhead, she trapped the rifle between their bodies, twisting it away as her knee drove into his thigh. Collapsing his stance, Varga grunted, fighting to recover. But Mara stayed inside his reach, where the weapon was useless, and his size worked against him. She hooked his leg, pivoted, and sent him crashing into the cart with a metallic impact that would have echoed into the cabin if not for the engines roaring around them. She finished it fast, eh? Sharp strike to the side of the neck. A controlled choke, just long enough. Vargas sagged to the floor beside Novak. Alive, breathing, neutralized, Mara stood still for half a second. Listening footsteps. Viktor Kovac pushed through the curtain with his firearm already raised. He absorbed the scene without surprise. 2 men down. The flight attendant standing alone, posture changed, no longer slumped, no longer small. Her eyes were steady, focused, unafraid. Viktor smiled slowly. He told her she should have run when she had the chance. Mara didn't answer. Her mind was already working, cataloging the distance to the emergency kit behind him. The angle of his stance, the way his finger rested too confidently on the trigger. She knew she couldn't close the distance before he fired, so she changed the equation. Her hand dropped toward the counter, fingers brushing the open medical pouch she had quietly unzipped earlier while passing through the galley. Viktor tracked the movement instantly and fired. The shot went wide as Mara twisted sideways, the round slamming into the metal frame inches from her head. She rolled behind the cart and came up with the injector already primed in her hand. Viktor fired again. The round grazed her arm, the pain flashing hot and sharp. Mara didn't slow. She drove forward through smoke and noise, crashing into him with everything she had. The injector plunged into his thigh, fast-acting sedative. Measured dose. Viktor snarled and struck her across the face with the butt of his weapon. Stars exploded across her vision, but she stayed upright, staying inside his reach. Counting under her breath, 1.2, Viktor staggered. His movements slowed, strength draining from him in real time. He tried to lift the gun again, but his arm refused to respond. 3. He dropped to one knee. Confusion flickering across his face as his body betrayed him, for Mara caught him as he fell. Lowering him to the floor with the same care she'd shown Novak, she kicked the weapon away and stepped back. Chest heaving, blood running from the cut along her arm, the galley went still. There were no speeches, no victory stance, no release of tension. Mara checked all 3 men quickly, securing restraints with practiced efficiency. Then she turned and pushed through the curtain without looking back. The cabin froze as she emerged. Passengers stared as if she had stepped out of a different story than the one they were trapped in. Smoke lingered faintly. The engines filled the space once owned by hijackers. Voices. Mara didn't meet anyone's eyes. She moved straight toward the front of the aircraft. Stride purposeful now, no longer hiding how she carried herself. Linda. Moore caught a glimpse of her face as she passed and felt something settle into place. This wasn't panic. This was command. Mara reached the cockpit door and struck it once, sharp and controlled. She identified herself clearly, voice cutting through chaos without effort. When the door opened, she stepped inside without hesitation, because neutralizing the threat had never been the end. Flying the plane home was. The cockpit smelled of sweat, metal, and fear. First Officer Daniel Price was still strapped into his seat, wrists bound tight. His eyes snapped up, expecting a hijacker, then widened when he realized it was the flight attendant standing there alone. Mara crossed the space in 3 quick steps and cut his restraints with a blade, already in her hand. Price inhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Captain Robert Hayes lay slumped forward, unconscious but breathing. Blood marked his temple. Alarms blinked softly across the panel and attended. But stable, Mara checked the captain in one efficient motion, confirmed a pulse, then turned to Price. "Get me clearance," she said. Already sliding into the left seat, she didn't ask. Her hands found the controls. With instinctive certainty adjusting trim, scanning instruments, stabilizing the aircraft like she had never left the cockpit. The yoke felt familiar, grounding her in a way nothing else could. Price stared at her for half a second too long. Then training took over. He reached for the radio, hands shaking, opening the channel. Before he could speak, Mara leaned in and took the mic herself. Her voice didn't get louder. It got cleaner. Center, this is Civilian Flight 279. Hostile takeover contained. Request immediate priority handling and vectors to nearest suitable field. There was a pause, the kind that meant reality was being recalculated. Mara waited, eyes scanning altitude, airspeed, fuel state. She adjusted heading slightly, smoothing the aircraft's response with practiced ease. Confirm hostile status, the controller replied. Cautious now, Mara didn't hesitate. 3 hostiles neutralized. Captain, incapacitated. I am assuming control. Price turned fully toward her, disbelief written across his face. The response came back faster this time. Urgency threaded through it. Credentials requested. Mara's eyes stayed forward. Captain Mara Ellison, she said evenly. United States Air Force. Retired. The words landed in the cockpit with weight. Price's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at her hands on the controls. The way she guided the aircraft through light turbulence without breaking rhythm. The way she spoke, like the sky had always belonged to her. Outside the cockpit, the cabin had gone silent. Passengers strained to hear fragments through the overhead speakers. The flight attendant's voice came through authoritative, speaking a language few understood. Inside, the controller acknowledged. Coordinates followed. Emergency services mobilized. Fighter escort mentioned without drama. Mara answered each instruction crisply. No wasted words. No fear slipping through. Price finally found his voice. He asked when she had last flown. Mara did not look at him. A long time ago, she said. Her hands guided the aircraft into a shallow, deliberate descent. Movement smooth and assured, eyes clear and focused. The machine responded as if it recognized her touch, as if it remembered who she was. In the cabin, passengers remained frozen in their seats, listening. Minutes earlier, they had watched her kneel in the aisle. They had seen her hand out water, absorb insults, disappear into the background. Now her voice filled the aircraft, steady and controlled, and the world shifted around it. There was no cheering, no applause. Only silence, the kind that arrives when disbelief replaces fear and awe, steals the breath from a room. And inside that silence, the truth settled heavily and unmistakably. The woman they had dismissed had taken command of the sky. The landing was firm enough to be felt in the bones, but disciplined enough to be trusted. The wheels struck the runway with a solid, grounding thump. The aircraft slowed under practiced hands. Reversers roared. Brakes held. The long, unbroken scream of fear that had lived inside the cabin for hours finally found release, leaking out as sobs, sharp breaths, and stunned quiet. When the plane came to a stop, no one moved at first. Then her instructions came over the speaker, calm and precise. Guiding passengers through the final moments like a steady hand resting on a shoulder, emergency crews waited outside. Fire trucks lined the runway. Red and blue lights washed across the windows in pulsing color. One by one, the doors opened. Passengers filed out slowly, legs unsteady, faces pale, clutching children and strangers alike. Some cried openly. Some stared straight ahead, eyes hollow with shock. Others glanced back again and again. As if expecting the nightmare to follow them down the stairs, Emily Carter stepped onto the tarmac holding her son. Owen pressed tightly against her chest. Her hand trembled, but she was upright. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back toward the aircraft. Tears spilling freely now, gratitude too large for language. Dr. Brooks followed, wiping his hands against his jacket like he was finally letting the tension drain away. Linda Moore came next, her face drawn but proud, scanning the crowd as if counting survivors one last time. Inside the cabin, Mara Ellison stayed where she was. She completed the final checks with First Officer Price, secured the cockpit, and confirmed the handoff with authorities. Only when everything else was finished did she rise from the captain's seat. Her arm burned where the round had grazed her. Her jaw ached where Victor had struck her. She ignored both. She stepped into the aisle and walked toward the exit. Her pace unhurried, her shoulders squared. The cabin was empty now, stripped of fear and voices, leaving only the quiet hum of a machine at rest. Mara descended the stairs last. The tarmac air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of jet fuel and rain. Cameras clicked somewhere beyond the barricades. Emergency personnel moved with purpose, but the center of the scene had already gone still. A man waited at the foot of the stairs. Lieutenant General Richard Hale stood in a crisp, unadorned uniform, posture straight, expression unreadable. He did not look toward the cameras. He did not look at the officers surrounding him. He looked only at Mara for a single heartbeat. Time seemed to pause. Then General Hale stepped forward and raised his hand in a sharp, unmistakable salute. It was clean, precise. Public Mara stopped. She had not expected this. Not here. Not like this. She returned the salute without hesitation, muscle memory rising to meet the moment before thought could interfere. Her hand came up steady. Her posture locked into something the uniform she wore was never meant to carry. Camera flashes erupted like distant thunder. No words were spoken. None were required. The passengers watching from behind the barriers felt the meaning strike all at once. The pieces they had ignored snapped into place with startling clarity. The kneeling flight attendant, the quiet calm, the voice over the radio, the way fear had bent around her instead of breaking through her. Senator Whitmore stood among them, his earlier arrogance reduced to silence. He watched the salute with his mouth slightly open, understanding too late that he had confused power with importance. Emily Carter pushed gently through the crowd, still holding Owen. She did not rush. She did not interrupt. She waited until the salutes were finished, then met Mara's eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking, and hugged her without asking. Mara stood still for a moment, then returned the embrace carefully, gently, as if holding something fragile. Owen looked up at her, eyes wide, and whispered that she flew the plane like in the movies. Mara smiled faintly and shook her head. She told him pilots did not fly for movies. They flew for people around them. Faces softened. Some nodded. Some cried again, this time from relief rather than terror. A quiet understanding passed through the group, unspoken but shared. They had not been saved by luck. They had been saved by discipline. General Hale lowered his hand and stepped back, giving Mara the space she had earned. His expression held respect and recognition, the look of a man acknowledging a truth long understood within the profession. Mara adjusted the sleeve of her uniform, suddenly aware of how small it looked against what had just occurred. She did not seek the cameras. She did not lift her chin. She simply stood there, a woman who had done her job when it mattered most. And in that moment, on a rain-slicked runway beneath a gray sky, the cabin's fear finally released its grip. The passengers understood who she had been all along, and they would never forget it. Emily found Mara again near the edge of the tarmac, away from cameras and officials. Her hands still shook, but she walked with purpose now. Owen stayed tucked at her side like an anchor. She stopped a few feet away and studied Mara as if she needed proof she was real. Then she spoke, the words breaking apart as they left her mouth. She thanked her. She admitted she did not know how to say it properly. She confessed there had been a moment. On the plane, when she was certain she would never see her, Sungrow a panned that Mara had stood between. That fear and reality without hesitation. Mara listened without interrupting, eyes steady, shoulders relaxed. When Emily finished, Mara nodded once, as if accepting a fact rather than praise. She told her she was glad they were safe. Nothing more. Owen tugged gently at Mara's sleeve and looked up at her with absolute certainty. He said she was a hero. The word landed softly, but with weight. Mara crouched until she was at his eye level. She smiled small, genuine, shook her head. She told him heroes were capes in stories. She told him she had simply done her job at the right time. She told him the bravest thing he could do was take care of his mom and grow up kind. Owen considered this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. A few steps away, Senator Whitmore waited, hands clasped, the sharp edges of authority worn down by humility. When Mara turned, he cleared his throat and apologized, not with speeches, not with excuses, just an honest admission that he had been wrong. Mara accepted it without comment when a reporter finally asked why she had been working as a flight attendant. Why someone with her background would choose such a quiet life, Mara answered without drama. She said she had spent years making decisions whose consequences were measured in lives and wreckage. She said when she left that world, she wanted to keep flying without adding harm to it. She did not say she was tired of war. She did not say she was afraid. She said she wanted peace to be her default. The reflection settled in gently, like an after-action report written for the soul instead of the record. Courage, it explained, was not a volume knob. It was not something shouted into chaos. It was discipline held under pressure, training remembered when panic tried to take control, and humility strong enough to step forward without needing recognition. Mara. Ellison had not saved anyone by being louder than fear. She had saved them by being steadier. And the truth stayed with everyone who watched her walk away from the runway and back into anonymity without regret. Courage is not loud. It is steady when everything else collapses. Stories like Mara Ellison's remind us that some of the strongest people in the world do not wear their service on the outside. They stand in grocery lines, work ordinary jobs, and move quietly through our lives, carrying years of discipline and sacrifice on their shoulders without display. Many veterans never speak of what they did or what they lost. They choose calm lives not because they lack courage, but because they have already given so much of it. And when moments of crisis arrive, that quiet strength surfaces, shaken, precise, and ready, doing exactly what it was trained to do.